Deep within the subterranean depths of Cork Island Dungeon, the air hung heavy with the anticipation of a violent struggle. Peak Sword stood at the vanguard of the Silver Knights Guild, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead as his massive army of elite warriors filled the cavernous chamber. Beads of sweat rolled down the leader's face as the final seconds ticked away, the heat in the room rising to an unbearable intensity. A massive pillar of fire erupted in the center of the floor, signaling the imminent arrival of the boss, Helgao, while the guild members braced themselves for the fight of their lives. Just as the battle was set to begin, a sudden commotion at the rear of the formation drew every eye away from the flames. A lone, hooded figure stood silhouetted against the bright entrance of the cavern, having bypassed the guild's external defenses to intrude upon their private raid. The guild leader cast a suspicious glance back at the mysterious newcomer, his hand tightening on his weapon as he demanded to know the stranger's identity. The hooded intruder remained silent and unmoving, staring down the hundreds of elite soldiers who now viewed him as a dangerous wild card. His shock only deepened when he realized the intruder had single-handedly broken through his defensive line without a sound. As he stared in disbelief, a system interface flickered into existence, identifying the mysterious player as a man named Grid. Confusion rippled through the ranks of the Silver Knights as their leader attempted to search for the intruder's name in the official rankings, only to find nothing. He shouted in frustration, realizing that this man who had effortlessly breached their perimeter wasn't even a recognized ranker. Grid stood calmly between the massive stone pillars of the dungeon floor, letting out a weary sigh as the weight of his task settled in. Realizing his stealth had been neutralized, he gripped his cloak, prepared to reveal the gear he had been hiding. With a swift motion, the intruder cast aside his disguise to reveal a set of dark armor pulsing with an eerie red glow. The Silver Knights Guild members surrounding him recoiled in shock, their eyes widening at the sight. He stood tall and confident, finally displaying the full reveal of his legendary-looking dragon armor. A long, metallic tail whipped behind him, catching the light as the soldiers fell into a stunned silence. The surrounding warriors could only stare at the high-grade equipment, unable to reconcile it with a non-ranker. Peak Sword gritted his teeth in a mixture of frustration and disbelief at the mysterious intruder's presence. Snapping out of his daze, the guild leader raised his arm and barked orders for his men to seize the intruder immediately. The elite warriors of the Silver Knights shifted into combat stances, flanking their bearded commander in response. Together, the group prepared to engage in battle and forcibly remove the wildcard from the chamber. The air suddenly ignited as massive demonic eyes loomed over the cavern, signaling the arrival of the dungeon's true master. A colossal pillar of fire erupted from the earth, and from the heart of the inferno, a massive white axe emerged. Helgao fully manifested before the shocked soldiers, his towering frame wreathed in flickering flames. A system message flickered into existence, announcing that the Master of Hellfire had finally appeared. The Master of Hellfire raised his weapon high, triggering a system-wide heat debuff that sapped the strength of every warrior present. With a violent thrust, the boss unleashed his Fire Pillar's skill, creating a series of devastating explosions. Soldiers were caught in a violent fiery explosion, their bodies blasted away by the sheer force of the impact. The Silver Knights' ranks were decimated in a single, fiery stroke as the survivors screamed in agony. Peak Sword stood amidst the wreckage of his elite force, his breath hitching as he surveyed the charred remains of his guild. The 16th-ranked warrior could hardly believe his eyes, questioning if their entire mission had ended in a total failure before it truly began. Amidst the smoke, the mysterious intruder stood tall, his dark, segmented armor and metallic tail gleaming with an otherworldly light. Grid remained completely unfazed by the surrounding destruction, his presence commanding the attention of the few survivors left standing. From a distance, the guild leader could only watch in stunned silence as the stranger's true form was revealed. Turning his back on the chaos, Grid focused his attention on a glowing blue orb he held within his palm. The system interface flickered before him, confirming the rare nature of the minerals he had come to claim. Peak Sword looked on with a mixture of confusion and awe, unable to comprehend why anyone would prioritize loot in the middle of a slaughter. Without a word of explanation, the armored warrior raised a heavy pickaxe high above his head, his posture shifting into that of a focused laborer rather than a combatant. The Silver Knight's leader watched with wide eyes as the stranger began to swing the tool against the cavern walls with rhythmic precision. The sheer absurdity of the situation forced a gasp of disbelief from the commander, who couldn't fathom the audacity of mining while a boss monster loomed nearby. Grid continued to swing his pickaxe with singular focus, even as the massive, horned skeletal figure of Hel Gao loomed directly over him. The intense heat of the chamber caused the warrior to grit his teeth, yet he refused to stop his work, even joking about needing to visit a dragon's lair next. The Master of Hellfire unleashed a devastating strike, catching the lone miner in the center of a massive fiery explosion that rocked the entire dungeon floor. Peak's sword watched from the periphery as a blinding pillar of flame consumed the spot where the intruder had been standing. The resulting blast was so immense that it seemed to swallow the very air of the cavern. The guild leader shouted in pure shock, certain that no player could have survived such a concentrated, direct hit from the boss's flames. Thick smoke and roaring fire filled the air, masking the aftermath of the devastating blast for several tense seconds. However, as the inferno began to clear, Grid emerged from the embers completely unscathed, his armor still glowing as if the attack had been nothing more than a minor annoyance. Casually gesturing toward the stunned commander, Grid spoke with a neutral expression, seemingly more concerned with his mining progress than the legendary monster behind him. Hel Gao reached out with a massive, fiery hand, ready to crush the intruder who dared to ignore his power. Despite the imminent threat, the armored blacksmith remained remarkably calm, his eyes drifting toward the side as he prepared for his next move. The Master of Hellfire let out a bone-chilling roar, his skeletal face contorted in fury as flames erupted around him. Hel Gao lunged forward with his staff, determined to incinerate the intruder who dared to treat a legendary boss like a mere background nuisance. Unfazed by the looming threat, Grid stood his ground with a calm expression, his voice steady as he addressed the stunned onlookers. The tension in the cavern reached a breaking point as the gazes of the monster, the guild leader, and the mysterious blacksmith locked in a silent standoff. A confident smirk played across the protagonist's lips as he prepared to reveal the true power of his legendary equipment, leaving Peak's sword to wonder just what kind of monster he had truly encountered. Grid sprinted through the dark corridors of the northern end, his breath ragged as the sound of pursuit echoed behind him. He had spent months serving his quest-givers, yet now those same masked warriors were hunting him like prey. A sudden, sharp pain flared as one of the pursuers landed a strike, forcing the warrior to skid to a halt and brace for a desperate final stand. As he struggled to catch his breath, a cold voice cut through the air, and Earl Osher stepped into the light to confront him. The high-ranking noble looked down with a judgmental gaze, accusing the warrior of blinding himself with greed despite their standing contract. The sheer weight of the Earl's disapproval filled the cavern, leaving no room for negotiation. Grid could only grit his teeth and glare back with bloodshot eyes, his exhaustion turning into a bitter hatred for the man who had betrayed him. The noble continued his monologue with chilling calm, promising a reward for the warrior who had trampled on his good faith. Before another word could be spoken, a masked guard lunged forward with a glowing blade, forcing the protagonist to scramble away in a frantic bid for survival. The intense stress of the moment was etched into the warrior's face, a testament to the high stakes of the virtual world he inhabited. This was the reality of Satisfy, a game where millions of players don VR headsets to seek glory and fortune. In this digital realm, the line between a simple quest and a legendary struggle often blurred into a fight for one's very life. The journey that led to this catastrophe had begun under the starlit peaks of the mountains, leading deep into the heart of the northern end cave. It was there that Grid, a level 73 warrior, finally discovered the prize he had been searching for among the ancient ruins. He let out a triumphant cheer as he held the glowing red book, unaware that this legendary find would be the catalyst for his downfall. Wiping the sweat from his brow, the warrior reflected on the grueling months of effort and the small fortune he had poured into potions and equipment just to reach this point. He felt a surge of annoyance at the cost of the mission, spitting on the ground as he considered the toll it had taken on his resources. He was determined to be paid well for his trouble, vowing that he would never work with the noble again if the compensation wasn't life-changing. Grid stared at the quest item in his hands, confused by the unknown status that greeted him. He suddenly remembered a specific appraisal tool he had purchased for just such an occasion, pulling out a high-priced item window. The realization of what he was holding began to dawn on him as he prepared to reveal the book's true nature. Despite the crushing weight of the loans he had taken out to fund his gaming, Grid felt a manic surge of hope as he committed to the appraisal. The cavern was suddenly bathed in a blinding electrical light as the system confirmed he had acquired a legendary item, Pagma's rare book. This ancient tome held the secrets of a blacksmith who had transcended humanity, offering him the chance to become Pagma's descendant. The shock of obtaining a legendary class left Grid breathless, his mind racing with the sheer impossibility of his luck. He stood frozen for a moment, listening to the system's prompts before a greedy grin spread across his face. He realized that this single item could be his ticket out of poverty, potentially selling for a staggering 100 million won on the open market. Memories of his miserable reality flooded back, reminding him of the grueling manual labor he endured just to pay off his mounting debts. He recalled the stinging isolation of being abandoned by his peers and the disappointment in his family's eyes as they labeled him a failure. For a man who had been treated like a waste of space, this book represented more than just gold. It was his first taste of true success. Overwhelmed by emotion, Grid wept openly as he clutched the legendary tome, shouting to the heavens that his days of freeloading were finally over. He raised the book high in a triumphant gesture, envisioning the golden spoon lifestyle that was now within his reach. However, his celebration was cut short by a sudden, ominous system notification that chilled his blood. The shadows of the cave shifted as Earl Osher and his elite guards suddenly surrounded the stone pillar where Grid stood trapped. The powerful magician glared at him with cold fury, accusing the warrior of betraying their contract out of pure, selfish greed. A terrifying new system message flashed before Grid's eyes, announcing that the quest had evolved into the Earl's murderous rage. Earl Osher's face contorted with rage as he accused Grid of violating their contract through blatant greed. Grid shouted back, refusing to back down after the months of grueling effort he had invested in the quest. Unmoved by the warrior's defiance, the powerful magician stared him down with cold, murderous eyes and signaled his men to strike. A masked guard lunges with a raised blade. Grid grits his teeth and prepares for a desperate struggle. He refuses to let months of effort vanish, reminding himself that his level 73 status grants him the skills needed to survive. Grid lunges forward with a cry, activating stun and his guardian's shield in a frantic attempt to trip up his attackers behind a glowing blue barrier. The counterattack was a disaster, as a guard easily bypassed the defense with a concentrated magical orb that shattered Grid's momentum. He watched in horror as his stun attempt failed completely, leaving him wide open for a follow-up strike from behind that instantly drained half of his health bar. The impact left him surrounded by the relentless, charging soldiers. Tears of frustration welled in Grid's eyes as he cursed the abysmal luck that had followed him throughout his entire life. He realized that if he died now, the quest item would simply drop and fall right back into the Earl's hands. His gaze shifted toward the waist pouch where the legendary book was tucked away, and a frantic, last-ditch plan began to take shape. Cornered and out of options, Grid prepared for a final stand, knowing he couldn't let his enemies claim the prize he had suffered so much to find. The surrounding guards hesitated for a split second as a look of grim determination crossed the warrior's face. Without a moment's delay, he tore open the book, unleashing a violent surge of blue lightning that illuminated the entire cavern. A blinding transformation took hold as the system announced that the fundamental change to his existence had finally begun. Every previous skill and stat was wiped clean, replaced by the weight of a legendary legacy that transcended his former warrior class. In a rapid-fire sequence of notifications, the system confirmed that the legendary blacksmith's craftsmanship had been both created and instantly mastered. Grid stares at his notifications in disbelief, realizing his legendary transformation has turned him into a laborer, yet he still feels a surge of power from the class effects. He mocks Earl Osher, finding satisfaction in the noble's visible frustration as the legendary blacksmith skills continue to manifest. The moment of triumph is short-lived as the masked guards lunge forward to finish their grim task. As the transformation reached its peak, the system finalized the shift in his existence, stripping away his previous progress and resetting him to the very beginning. Grid looked down at the notification confirming he was now level 1, but instead of despair, a defiant grin spread across his face. He faced the incoming strike with an eerie calm, knowing that his journey as a legend had only just begun. The inevitable end came swiftly as a final system message declared his death, marking the conclusion of his desperate struggle in the cave. Far away from the virtual world, the silence of a modern mansion was broken by a report regarding the sudden emergence of a legendary class. A man in a white shirt listened intently to the update, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications of this unprecedented event. A knowing smile played across the man's lips as he contemplated the chaotic potential of the new legend that had just been born. The system notifications flashed with cold finality, stripping Grid of his hard-earned levels as the quest spiraled into a total failure. The magician Earl Osher stood over the fallen warrior, his body radiating a lethal blue mana that signaled a permanent banishment from the region. Grid could only stare up in disbelief, realizing the noble had resorted to using a powerful item just to ensure his absolute defeat. As the light of the game world began to fade, Grid's avatar fractured into thousands of blue particles, dissolving into nothingness. The protagonist's face twisted in a mask of shock and agony, his consciousness slipping away from the digital realm. Far from the northern end cave, the quiet stillness of the real world settled over a cluster of modern apartment buildings under the night sky. Shin Youngwoo sat up in his VR capsule, his body heavy with the weight of extreme fatigue and the crushing loss he had just endured. His bloodshot eyes widened as he found himself staring into the furious gaze of his mother, who loomed over him like a shadow. She immediately began to scold him, her voice sharp with frustration over his mounting debts and the endless hours he wasted inside the machine. Across the city, the SA Group's corporate headquarters pierced the night sky, a glowing monolith of glass and steel. Within the sterile confines of the underground garage, the assistant Choi Nahi stood waiting with professional poise as a luxury sedan glided to a halt. Nahi straightened her posture, ready to welcome her superior back to the heart of the operation. The car door swung open to reveal the mastermind Lim Keelho as he prepared to step back into his domain. The chairman immediately requested a status update, his mind already focused on the complex web of data that governed his creation. On a nearby holographic display, the digital silhouette of a warrior flickered to life, representing the very player who had just been cast out of the cave. Inside the high-tech command center, the team meticulously reviewed the latest game data while the assistant guided the chairman through the recent anomalies. The mastermind watched the screens with a calm, calculating expression, absorbing every detail of the unexpected progression. As the briefing continued, Nahi highlighted the specific circumstances surrounding Grid's character, only to be caught off guard by her boss's cryptic reaction. Her professional mask slipped for a moment, her confusion evident as she tried to process the chairman's strange interest in a seemingly failed player. Lim Keelho maintains his composure, his eyes gleaming with a certainty that others lack. He watches the data stream, where the image of a man raising Pagma's rare book in a fit of manic triumph flickers across the monitors. As he gestures toward the screen, the chairman begins to explain the profound implications of this specific turning point in the game's history. The digital reconstruction shows the player's avatar surging with raw, electrical energy as the transformation begins to take hold of his virtual body. The mastermind offers a knowing smile, completely unfazed by the violent display of power occurring within the simulation. In contrast, Choi Nahi can only stare in disbelief, her eyes wide as she witnesses a phenomenon that defies the system's standard logic. Lim Keelho settles into his seat, calmly detailing how this evolution will grant the player an unprecedented surge of 20 additional stat points with every level gained. On the display, The exhausted warrior lies motionless amidst the fading embers of his transformation, his body spent from the ordeal. The chairman continues his lecture with a steady gaze, fully aware that the balance of Satisfy has just been irrevocably altered. The assistant's professional composure shatters as she reacts to the impossible data, adjusting her glasses while the chairman listens intently, the sheer weight of the situation beginning to press even upon him. Lim Keelho remains a pillar of calm, looking down at his desk with a faint smile that suggests everything is proceeding as he intended. He eventually looks up, his expression hardening into a look of absolute seriousness that demands total focus. Choi Nahi stands frozen before him, clutching a folder as she tries to reconcile the chairman's intensity with the chaotic events unfolding in the game. The sign for the Gumho Manpower Office glows against the night sky as the day's labor concludes. Shin Youngwoo stands motionless in a daze until a heavy hand claps onto his shoulder, jolting him back to the harsh reality of his life. His foreman barks at him to snap out of it and head inside to collect his pay for the work he finished that morning. Youngwoo mutters a curse under his breath and trudges toward the office while the other workers look on with annoyance. Shin Youngwoo stares at the ground, his face a mask of frustration and exhaustion as the weight of his real-world debt settles back onto his shoulders. The transition from a potential legend in a virtual world to a struggling laborer in reality is a bitter pill to swallow. He remains lost in his own thoughts, the silence of the night doing little to ease the irritation gnawing at his mind. Shin Youngwoo sits on a park ledge, his mouth agape as he stares blankly at the night sky. The exhaustion of the day's labor clings to him, leaving him with a weary expression that reflects his hollow bank account. He remains motionless as a sleek car cuts through the quiet of the evening, its headlights momentarily illuminating his resigned face. A vibrant blue sports car tears down the asphalt, a stark symbol of the wealth that feels worlds away from the construction site. Inside, a man in a sharp suit grips the steering wheel, speaking calmly about another person as if their lives were merely pieces on a board. The vehicle speeds onward, a blur of luxury disappearing into the urban landscape. The driver wears a knowing smirk, his confidence unshakable as he navigates the city streets. Back on the ledge, Shin Youngwoo buries his head in his hands, the meager stack of bills in his palm a cruel reminder of his mounting debts. His despair finally boils over into a raw shout of frustration directed at the uncaring sky, his fingers trembling around his small earnings. His knuckles turn white as he grips the currency with a desperate, white-knuckled intensity. The anger begins to shift into something sharper, and a sudden, confident smile breaks across the young man's face as he looks toward the road with renewed purpose. In the quiet solitude of his apartment, Shin Youngwoo prepared to escape his mounting debts by diving back into the virtual world of Satisfy. He settled into his capsule with a heavy sigh, knowing that even if his luck was abysmal, he had to keep pushing forward. As the VR headset lowered over his eyes, the familiar hum of the machine signaled the start of another desperate gamble for fortune. The transition began with a blinding surge of digital data as Grid's consciousness was pulled through the game's complex interface. A glowing blue portal materialized, marking the gateway between reality and the sprawling simulation governed by the AI Morpheus. However, the welcoming light soon faded, replaced by the grim and oppressive atmosphere of a withered, lightless forest. A geometric pillar of blue light descended from the heavens, depositing the protagonist into the center of the desolate clearing. Grid materialized within the game world, standing shirtless and shivering against the unnatural chill of the dead woods. He looked around in a daze, his confusion mounting as he realized he wasn't in the familiar territory he had expected. Scanning the eerie environment, the debt-ridden warrior realized he needed to find a landmark to orient himself in this wasteland. He picked his way through the skeletal remains of trees, his senses on high alert for any hidden dangers lurking in the shadows. His search eventually led him to the base of a massive mountain, its jagged face riddled with dark, inviting cave openings. Deep within the mountain's bowels, a sinister ritual was already underway as cultists channeled purple magic over an unconscious captive. They stood before a towering demonic entity, their dark incantations filling the chamber with a suffocating, malevolent energy. Unaware of the horror unfolding further inside, Grid cautiously stepped into the mouth of the cave, his hand hovering near his side as he entered the gloom. A sudden system notification flashed across his vision, announcing that he had stepped into the forbidden grounds of the Yatan Temple. The realization hit Grid like a physical blow, his eyes widening in shock as he processed the sheer danger of such a high-level dungeon. He froze in place, the weight of the situation settling over him as the interface confirmed his worst fears. The air grew heavy with the presence of unseen threats, leaving the warrior to wonder if his legendary bad luck had finally led him to his doom. Despite the overwhelming odds, he stared deeper into the darkness, knowing that the path forward was the only way to survive. Grid marveled at the weight of the massive silver greatsword in his hands, striking a powerful pose as energy swirled around the blade. He couldn't hide his shock at the weapon's presence, his expression shifting from disbelief to pure, unadulterated joy. Overwhelmed by his good fortune, he fell to his knees and celebrated amidst a shower of sparkling light. The moment of celebration was short-lived as Grid knelt silently in the shadows, paralyzed by the realization of where he truly was. Sweat beaded on his forehead while he calculated the impossible level of the dungeon, his eyes darting toward the center of the chamber. There, hooded cultists chanted in low, rhythmic tones, their hands raised as purple energy began to coalesce around a central altar. The malevolent power intensified as they channeled the dark magic into a woman lying unconscious on the stone, her life force flickering under the assault. Knowing that wandering aimlessly through the temple would be a death sentence, the cultists gathered to patrol the dark floors. Grid tried to maintain his composure, forcing a confident smile even as he remained oblivious to the massive, shadowed figure looming directly behind him. The air turned ice-cold the moment a heavy, gloved hand clamped down on his shoulder, shattering his bravado and leaving him drenched in a cold sweat. Startled, Grid instinctively swung his massive blade in a wide arc, the blue energy of the strike cutting through the air with surprising force. He stood trembling and nervous, listening intently as the stranger warned him to calm down before he accidentally killed someone. The tension eased slightly when the man in the blue cloak adjusted his hood, introducing himself as Doran with a calm, confident smirk. Outside the immediate conflict, a strange rock formation stood like a hollowed sentinel within the forest, marking the entrance to these hidden depths. Doran explained that a silver-haired woman had been kidnapped during his absence, her body now enveloped by wisps of dark purple energy as she lay in a deep trance. As the two men stood over her, a sudden system notification chimed through the air, causing Grid to jump at the unexpected sound. A system window appears detailing the mission to rescue Irene, the Earl's daughter, within 1 hour for a reward of 3,000 gold and a slim chance of becoming the Earl's son-in-law. Doran observes Grid's calm demeanor, remarking that most people would be paralyzed by fear in such a place, yet Grid remains unfazed. Grid's surprise grows as another notification announces the awakening of a special ability. He reads the description of the composure trait, which confirms the system has recognized his mental fortitude. Doran spoke with a relieved smile, convinced that divine favor was finally shining upon Lord Stein. Grid's eyes nearly popped out of his head at the suggestion that followed, his disbelief mounting as the gravity of the request sank in. He flatly refused with a comedic burst of stubbornness, but the man in the blue cloak remained desperate to convince him. Panicked, the young warrior questioned the sheer insanity of being asked to face an entire coven of black magicians on his own. Internally, Grid weighed the potential rewards against the suicidal risks, reminding himself that his current miserable state was the result of another S-grade quest gone wrong. Doran fell to his knees, desperately begging for the warriors' assistance in their dire hour. Despite the heartfelt plea, Grid's resolve remained firm as he shouted a final, aggressive rejection of the impossible task. The two continued their heated argument, with Grid insisting he was far too weak to be of any help, while Doran countered that he could sense the warrior's hidden strength. Their bickering was cut short when they both froze, staring down at a gruesome sight that chilled them to the bone. Nearby, a group of dark cultists stood over the bloodied remains of a fallen comrade, their presence turning the argument into a secondary concern. The system confirms the acceptance of the quest to rescue the Earl's daughter, catching Grid off guard. Grid shouts in surprise at the sudden notification, while Doran adopts a serious, battle-ready expression. High above them, hooded enemies begin a frenzied descent down the cavern's spiral stone path. Doran drew his daggers with practiced ease, instructing Grid to protect the lady while he cleared a passage through the enemy ranks. The cultists roared in a religious frenzy, screaming for the blood of those who had desecrated their faith as they lunged toward the duo. Grid watched in terror as the aggressive horde closed the distance, their weapons drawn for a slaughter. Realizing there was no longer any room for debate, the young warrior began to move with a look of pure distress etched across his face. Shin Youngwoo, known as Grid, felt the cold grip of despair as his enemies closed in for the kill. Just as he braced for the end, a blur of motion intervened, cutting through the air with lethal precision. The mysterious savior moved like a shadow, his dual daggers flashing in the dim light of the alley. With a series of fluid strikes, he carved through the robed attackers. The warrior took a focused stance, preparing to unleash his full strength against the remaining foes. He lunged forward, taking down 2 enemies at once with a powerful dual dagger strike. Finally, he launched into a devastating mid-air spin, a whirlwind of steel that cleared the path in seconds. Grid watched in awe, his hope reignited by the sheer speed and efficiency of his unexpected protector. Despite the momentary reprieve, the shadows still pulsed with the threat of more reinforcements lurking nearby. The agile fighter eventually came to a halt, standing over the battered protagonist with an expression that bordered on annoyance. The situation took a vertical turn as the pair suddenly plummeted down a dark, narrow shaft. Panicked screams echoed against the stone walls until a sudden surge of magic halted their terminal velocity. Suspended in midair by an unseen force, they drifted toward the bottom of the abyss. They touched down safely within the hidden chamber, though the tension between the two remained thick. After a brief, sarcastic exchange that left Grid feeling slightly embarrassed, they moved deeper into the gloom. Their exploration was cut short when they stumbled upon a group of cultists gathered for a dark ritual. The cultists wasted no time, calling upon their twisted spells to punish the intruders for their interference. Grid and his companion braced themselves as black magic began to swirl through the air. The dagger wielder responded with a flurry of thrown blades, aiming to disrupt the casters before they could finish their incantations. Just as the chaos reached its peak, a hand reached out to stop the protagonist from rushing forward. A hooded leader barked orders to his followers, demanding they sacrifice themselves to buy more time for the ritual. Doran didn't hesitate, diving back into the fray to keep the overwhelming numbers at bay. Watching the master at work, Grid couldn't help but shout his praise for the warrior's incredible combat skills. Grid watched with a sinister grin, his eyes glowing with the vicarious thrill of the slaughter as he cheered for his companion. He hailed the warrior as his hope and sunshine, leaving the stoic fighter visibly flustered by the sudden, enthusiastic praise. However, the celebration was cut short when the hooded leader completed a devastating incantation, catching the warrior off guard. A violent eruption of purple energy consumed the battlefield, swallowing the hero in a blinding magical explosion. Seeing the apparent defeat of his protector, Grid slumped in comical despair, instantly regretting his enthusiastic cheers and jokingly considering a career change to the enemy's side. The cult leader roared with maniacal laughter, certain of his victory, until a grim presence stirred within the smoke. With eyes glowing white and a face set in stone, the warrior declared his intent to finish the mission at any cost. With a single, earth-shattering punch, he unleashed a shockwave that tore through the lingering black magic. Grid looked up in sheer disbelief as the oppressive dark energy was shattered by nothing more than raw physical force. Sensing the shift in momentum, the warrior conjured a swarm of glowing energy daggers, his focus sharpening as the surrounding cultists began to panic. He didn't give them a moment to recover, leaping into the air to rain down a lethal barrage of blades upon the frantic casters. The magical projectiles streaked through the air like falling stars, homing in on the desperate group of cultists. One by one, the dark mages were struck down, their defenses shattered by the precise and overwhelming magical assault. But as the dust began to settle, both Grid and his companion froze, their expressions turning to shock as they sensed a far more dangerous presence approaching. Cold sweat beaded on Grid's forehead as he stared wide-eyed at the silhouette emerging from the shadows. A mysterious woman stepped onto the battlefield, her long dress trailing behind her with an air of terrifying elegance. She gripped an ornate magical staff and looked upon the scene with cold confidence, noting how rare it was to encounter a named NPC of such caliber. A knowing smirk played across her lips, signaling that for this newcomer, the life-or-death struggle was nothing more than a thrilling game. The battlefield trembled as Yura, the top-ranked black magic player, stood amidst the chaos with her crimson staff held high. With a calm gaze that betrayed no hesitation, the high-ranking mage swung her weapon to unleash a devastating wave of red energy that swept across the front lines. The resulting magical explosion sent the surrounding warriors flying backward, their formations shattered by the sheer force of the blast. From the edge of the crater, a lone survivor watched the black magic user with gritted teeth, only to find her wearing a confident smile as the swirling energy settled around her. Staring at the interface in disbelief, the sword wielder realized the true gap in their power when he saw her staggering level. A cold sweat broke across his brow as he stared intensely, before exchanging a nervous glance with his companion as they realized this fight had become a desperate struggle for survival. Yura ascended above the fray, channeling a massive pillar of light that illuminated the entire cavern. The high-ranking mage looked down with a confident smile, even as the determined warrior lunged through the storm of energy. He focused with a grimace, convinced that a single step of superior speed could turn the tide of the battle as he leapt through the flurry of attacks. His momentum was cut short when the black magic user extended her hand, weaving a burst of purple mana. The warrior cried out in shock as magical tendrils snared his legs mid-stride. Trapped and desperate, he prepared a counterattack and unleashed a final barrage of glowing daggers toward his opponent. The high-ranking mage effortlessly deflected the projectiles with her staff, her expression remaining chillingly calm. The warrior could only watch in stunned silence as his desperate gambit failed. With a cruel intent, she invoked a blood magic curse and promised to drain the very life from his veins to lighten his heavy body. A spray of crimson erupted from the man's chest as the spell took hold, leaving the young Shin Youngwoo to watch in horror as his ally fell. The black magic user gloated over her seemingly defeated opponent, certain the battle was won. However, the warrior refused to stay down, activating a glowing ring that surged with a sudden, blinding golden energy. With a look of renewed determination, he prepared to reveal the true extent of his hidden power. The sudden surge of energy left the sorceress stunned, her confidence evaporating in an instant. Shin Youngwoo rushed to his ally's side to check on his condition, but the warrior was already focused on the task at hand. Gripping the source of his new strength, the man prepared to unleash the ring's full potential against his shocked foe. The exchange turned even more aggressive as the combatants traded taunts amidst the chaos of the dungeon. Both warriors braced themselves for the next collision, pushing their limits to gain the upper hand. A flurry of daggers whistled through the air just before a massive wave of magical energy erupted from a staff, threatening to consume everything in its path. Frustration boiled over as the battle dragged on, the intensity of the struggle etched clearly on the faces of the combatants. One figure could barely contain their rage, their expression twisting into a mask of pure aggression. Amidst the violence, a moment of doubt flickered as they realized just how dangerous this cursed cave had truly become. The situation took a turn for the worse when enemies began to respawn behind the group, catching the young warrior completely off guard. Shin Youngwoo reacted with pure shock, realizing the quest was spiraling out of control. Seeing a desperate opening, a dark spell began to take shape as the caster prepared to seize victory before the reinforcements could close in. A focused gaze marked the final preparation of a devastating magical attack that crackled with dark intent. The air itself seemed to scream as a massive storm of energy was unleashed, tearing through the cavern. A colossal red blast swept across the battlefield, leaving the remaining warriors to stand their ground against the overwhelming force. The blinding light of the explosion consumed the warrior, whose final cry of terror was cut short as the magical force overwhelmed him. He was completely engulfed by the searing radiance, leaving no doubt that the strike had landed with lethal precision. As the dust began to settle, the sorceress stood amidst the smoldering ruins of the battlefield, a cold silhouette against the fading glow of her own destruction. Believing the threat had been neutralized, the sorceress walked calmly through the thick smoke while muttering that her enemies were finally dead. However, a pair of armored legs emerged from the haze, signaling that her confidence was premature. Shin Youngwoo stood perfectly unharmed amidst the debris, his expression one of pure shock as he and his companion realized they had somehow survived the cataclysm. The sight of the survivors standing amidst the wreckage sent a jolt of pure disbelief through the sorceress, her face twisting into a mask of mounting fury. Shin Youngwoo stood frozen as blue energy swirled around his feet, his mind racing to make sense of the chaotic battlefield. He stared in disbelief at his status window, sweating nervously as he realized he had survived the impact with exactly 1 health point remaining. A sudden, intense realization hit him, forcing him to look at the situation with new, wide-eyed clarity. The surrounding environment remained eerily still as the dust began to settle over the jagged terrain, while every shadow seemed to stretch across the ground to mark the passage of a silent, tense moment. The atmosphere grew heavy and suffocating as the unseen forces governing this world watched the unfolding drama, and no movement broke the silence, leaving only the cold wind to whistle through the cracks. This stillness felt like a brief reprieve before the next inevitable clash, where every detail of the landscape stood out in sharp relief, frozen in time. Finally, the tension reached a breaking point, though the source of the coming change remained hidden. High above the ground, the mage gritted her teeth and channeled a massive surge of glowing blue magical energy into her staff. Shin Youngwoo braced himself as his crystal shield finally reached its limit, the protective barrier splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He raised his arm to shield his face, but the flying shards of the broken defense tore through the air around him. The mage stood amidst the lingering trails of blue energy, her eyes wide with shock as she surveyed the aftermath of the explosion. She looked toward the horizon, watching the thick cloud of smoke slowly dissipate from the center of the crater. A chilling realization washed over her as she stared at the spot where her opponent stood. He hadn't even made a move, despite possessing such overwhelming strength. The victorious warrior stood atop the rocky slope, looking down in confusion at the motionless figure lying amidst the smoke and debris. Back in the physical world, Shin Youngwoo sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the screen with an expression of pure exhaustion. The harsh reality of the game system flashed before his eyes, notifying him that he had died and suffered a devastating loss of 2 levels, dropping him to level -3. He could only stare in silence at the final penalty message, the weight of his failures settling heavily upon him. The humiliation was compounded as a heavy boot ground into his back, pinning him to the dirt. Shin Youngwoo watched in horror as his health bar finally bottomed out, the realization of his absolute defeat sinking in. Consumed by a white-hot fury, he let out a desperate scream of rage against the one who had brought him to this point. The mysterious mage stood amidst the magical residue of the battlefield, her expression twisting into one of pure outrage as she realized the nature of her victory. She couldn't fathom why her opponent had yielded the quest to her, viewing his sacrifice as a personal insult rather than an act of mercy. Back in the physical world, Shin Youngwoo slumped in his messy room, the weight of his digital ruin pressing down on him. His mind raced with bitter memories of the woman who had ruined his chance at a happy ending, convincing himself that she was nothing more than a beautiful obstacle. To vent his frustration, he turned to the internet, frantically typing out hate posts on the community forums to tarnish her reputation. He joined a chorus of online trolls, claiming her beauty was a lie and her personality was rotten to the core. Shin Youngwoo let out a hollow, manic laugh at his own misfortune, fully embracing the role of a loser while he continued his digital crusade. His frantic typing was interrupted when his younger sister burst into the room, looking at her brother with a mixture of pity and genuine concern. She surveyed the mountain of trash and the disheveled state of his living space, her disappointment evident as she began to clean up after him. Despite her sharp tongue and constant nagging about his lack of maturity, the protagonist could only offer a weak explanation from the safety of his gaming capsule. He watched her work with a look of annoyance, feeling the sting of her judgment as she bagged the remnants of his isolation. Finally, he settled back into the capsule, trying to justify his actions to the only person who still bothered to check on him. The two of them stared at the computer screen together, the harsh glow illuminating the grim reality of his situation. In a moment of dramatic despair, he pointed toward a hanging noose, his eyes wide with a frantic, sweating expression that bordered on the absurd. His sister simply turned away, walking out of the room as he shouted one last desperate complaint after her. Alone once more, he gritted his teeth in a fit of silent rage, his eyes glowing with the intensity of his unresolved frustration. The quiet exterior of the apartment building stood as a silent witness to the secluded life he led within. Inside, he tried to find some semblance of normalcy, sitting down to a simple meal of noodles while turning on the television to distract himself from his failures. His attention was immediately caught by a breaking news broadcast featuring a reporter who looked visibly shaken by the events she was describing. Shin Youngwoo froze mid-bite, his eyes widening as he recognized the location being shown on the screen. The reporter gestured toward a massive pile of rubble, explaining that the ancient temple had completely collapsed during the night. Shin Youngwoo was mid-bite when the news hit him like a physical blow, causing him to spray his noodles across the room in a fit of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at the screen with wide, sweating eyes, his mind racing as the gravity of the investigation's findings began to sink in. On the television, a woman cloaked in mystery appeared, her serious expression signaling that the temple's destruction was only the beginning of a much larger story. At the site of the Rocky disaster, a pair of news reporters stood amidst the rubble to deliver their live update. One of them looked visibly nervous, a single bead of sweat rolling down their face as they struggled to maintain their composure under the pressure. However, the professional atmosphere was quickly shattered when one reporter became completely distracted by infatuation, earning an exasperated glare from their partner who just wanted to focus on the broadcast. Within the virtual world, the aftermath of a powerful spell left the witnesses in a state of utter disbelief as they spoke of the impossible event they had just seen. Two warriors stood in a defensive posture, their faces etched with worry as they tried to make sense of the overwhelming force that had just been unleashed. They began to question the true identity of the person responsible, realizing that if the rumors were true, the balance of power had shifted forever. While others discussed the mysterious figure's appearance and confirmed her striking presence, Shin Youngwoo sat cross-legged on his floor, continuing to eat, while his eyes remained glued to the glowing interface. The screen before him finally confirmed the impossible truth, displaying his new legendary class as Pagma's descendant and the prestigious title of the one who became legend. This transformation granted him extraordinary passive abilities, from increased item enhancement rates to the unique power to ignore equipment restrictions. Even more incredible was the revelation of a final survival skill, promising invulnerability when his health reached its absolute limit. A news reporter stands before the smoking ruins of a temple that collapsed overnight, delivering a shocking update to the world of Satisfy. As he points toward the debris, he explains the sheer scale of the destruction left in the wake of the disaster. The broadcast then shifts to a profile of the culprit, the black magician Yura, whose cold and focused gaze suggests a power far beyond ordinary players. Back in the studio, the reporter and his companion react with visible tension to the unfolding details of the incident. The analyst leans forward with a serious expression, carefully considering the implications of such a high-level event. He begins to explain the terrifying reality of Yura's involvement, describing a feat that seems almost impossible even for a top-tier player. Seasoned warriors stand frozen in shock at the temple, their combined attacks failing to leave even a scratch on their target. Inside his cramped apartment, Shin Youngwoo slurps ramen while staring intently at the news broadcast. A sudden realization twists his face into a mask of pure greed as he calculates the massive fortune he could rake in from this information. Grid lunges for his smartphone with desperate energy, determined to capitalize on the news before the opportunity slips through his fingers. He paces his living room with the phone pressed to his ear, shouting with a mix of joy and disbelief at the potential windfall. His excitement only grows as he talks, his face lighting up with the conviction that his luck has finally turned. By the end of the call, he is practically screaming into the receiver, convinced that he is finally the man in control of his own destiny. The high of the moment vanishes instantly when the call abruptly disconnects, leaving Grid staring at his phone in stunned silence. He sinks to the floor, his head hanging low as the crushing weight of his reality returns to haunt him. Despite his despair, his eyes drift back to the television, where the news report continues to detail the aftermath of the temple's fall. The screen flickers with chaotic footage of two figures caught in the center of a massive explosion, surrounded by a swirling cloud of dust and debris. A woman desperately supports a cloaked man who appears severely injured, her face etched with concern as she tries to lead him through the wreckage. Back in his room, Grid leans in closer, his expression shifting to one of intense shock as he witnesses the sheer scale of the violence on the screen. The tragic sight of a woman weeping over her fallen companion triggers a bittersweet memory for Shin Young-woo, reminding him of a kind-hearted NPC he once knew. While he acknowledges the man's genuine helpfulness during a difficult quest, his sentimentality quickly gives way to his characteristic greed. He can't help but smirk while admiring a stolen magic ring, wishing the old man had simply handed over his treasures before meeting his end. Exhausted by the weight of his debts and the day's failures, Shin Young-woo collapses onto his bed to escape into sleep. However, the television remains on, broadcasting a popular gaming segment where a cheerful host introduces a special guest to the audience. The spotlight shifts to a confident warrior named Katz, who introduces himself to the viewers with the arrogant air of a top-tier player. While the debt-ridden warrior drifts into a restless slumber, the broadcast continues with Katz boasting about his recent legendary feats within the world of Satisfy. The high-level player's words eventually pierce through the fog of sleep, causing Shin Young-woo's eyes to snap open in sudden realization. He bolts upright in bed, his face pale with shock as the implications of the news report finally sink in. Elsewhere in the vast world of Satisfy, two seasoned warriors stand amidst a sun-drenched landscape, locked in a serious discussion about the shifting power dynamics of the current era. One of them points forward with unwavering confidence, declaring his intent to completely reshape the competitive landscape. His companion looks on with a skeptical expression, clearly doubting the feasibility of such a bold proclamation. The tension between the two warriors reaches a breaking point when the confident fighter offers to reveal the secret behind his rapid leveling. He draws a massive, energy-infused red sword, challenging his companion to witness the true source of his overwhelming strength. The blade pulses with a malevolent crimson light, radiating a level of power that far exceeds any standard equipment. The sheer intensity of the weapon's aura leaves the warrior paralyzed with shock, his gaze fixed on the terrifying craftsmanship of the blade. Pulsing red and black steel reveals intricate, dark energy flowing through the metal like a living heartbeat. As the reality of the weapon's power settles in, the warrior's skepticism is replaced by a deep, gnawing sense of worry for the future. A menacing figure known as a blood warrior sat in a darkened room, his eyes widening in disbelief at the data flickering across his screen. He could hardly process the report that a player managed to level up so explosively using only a single skill. The sheer impossibility of the feat left the warrior drenched in a cold sweat as he stared intensely at the monitor. Far from the prying eyes of rival players, the majestic spires of a new destination rose against the horizon. A system notification chimed to announce that Grid had successfully entered Byran Village. He materialized in the bustling town square, looking around with a confused expression as he adjusted to the sudden change in scenery. Grid scanned the lively crowd, taking in the diverse array of adventurers and locals filling the streets. His attention was drawn to an energetic elf-like figure shouting at the top of their lungs to capture the attention of the passing masses. Nearby, a warrior clad in polished green armor stood with his hands on his hips, watching the spectacle with a confident and knowing smile. Grid beamed with excitement over his recent progress, but a flicker of social anxiety soon caused him to break into a nervous sweat. Steeling his resolve, He approached a burly man lounging on a wooden cart to strike up a conversation. The large, bearded stranger took a swig from his bottle while listening to the young man's enthusiastic chatter. However, the friendly atmosphere evaporated instantly when the man delivered a piece of news that left the young adventurer completely paralyzed with shock. Grid stared intensely at a glowing blue system window, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the information with his current situation. He stood nervously before the seated man, his posture stiff and uncertain under the stranger's steady gaze. The two remained locked in a tense exchange as the weight of the conversation settled over them. The bearded man continued to watch Grid closely, waiting for him to process the reality of his predicament. Overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events and the crushing weight of his circumstances, Grid collapsed to the ground and began to weep loudly, his despair echoing through the busy square. Shin Youngwoo collapsed in a desolate alleyway, his face streaked with tears as the crushing weight of his financial ruin set in. He clutched his head and screamed in pure agony, cursing the name of Earl Osher for the quest that had stripped him of his gold and dropped his level into the negatives. However, amidst his despair, a sudden realization flickered in his eyes, halting his outburst as he remembered the potential of his new class. Wiping away his tears, Grid pumped his fist with renewed vigor, determined to find a silver lining in his dire situation. He summoned his status window in the middle of the alley, his eyes scanning the blue holographic interface with desperate hope. His excitement peaked as he reviewed the details of legendary blacksmith's craftsmanship, a skill that promised mastery far beyond any ordinary player. He marveled at the potential of his new abilities, wondering if he could truly craft a weapon that would change his fortunes. Imagining himself wielding a massive, jagged blade of legend, he felt a surge of confidence he hadn't known before. Suddenly, a system notification flared to life, asking him to specify exactly what kind of item he wished to create using his legendary skill. Grid leaned in and tapped the interface, his mind racing as he began to navigate the complex creation process. The system immediately prompted him for the materials he intended to use, catching him off guard with the sheer depth of the requirements. He stared at the message in stunned silence, realizing that even a legendary blacksmith couldn't conjure something from nothing. Despite the material hurdle, Grid shared a confident smile with his companions, his resolve hardening as he stood within the castle courtyard. A new set of instructions appeared on his screen, detailing the intricate steps needed to design a weapon from scratch. He focused his entire being on the digital blueprint interface, ready to pour his imagination into a tangible design. With a steady hand, he began tracing glowing lines across the digital canvas, each stroke bringing his vision closer to reality. His face flushed with an ecstatic grin as the creative fever took hold, his eyes wide with the thrill of invention. Finally, he stepped back to admire the finished product, a crude but menacing drawing of a jagged sword that marked the true beginning of his legend. Grid stared at his crude sketch with a dazed, prideful grin, convinced he had just birthed a masterpiece. His moment of self-satisfaction was interrupted by a flashing system prompt, announcing that the design process was beginning and revisions would now be applied. Confusion washed over the legendary blacksmith as the jagged blueprint began to shift and glow with an otherworldly light. He could only watch in stunned silence while the interface processed his drawing, bathing the workshop in a blinding radiance as the calibration reached its peak. Once the light faded, a final notification confirmed the completion of the system's adjustments, leaving Grid with a sudden, intuitive understanding of the complex weapon data. He stood frozen in awe before the finished product, a magnificent, glowing jagged blue sword that far exceeded his wildest expectations. The sheer quality of the weapon sent Grid into a fit of fanboy excitement, his face flushing as he struggled to contain his joy. While a system window displayed the sword's overwhelming stats, a group of nearby high-level adventurers looked on with skeptical, unimpressed expressions. However, the high-level requirements listed on the item's status window quickly brought him back to reality, forcing him to think intensely about his own lacking strength points. The weight of his failure eventually crushed him, leaving the protagonist curled on the ground in a state of total despair. Grid narrowed his eyes and focused his thoughts, determined to find a way to bypass the limitations of his current level. He realized that his legendary class held the key to utilizing his gear, and as he looked upon the massive, jagged greatsword, he knew exactly what he needed to do to master it. Grid stood in the shadows of a narrow alleyway, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. He leaned forward with a fierce, determined gaze, preparing himself for a high-stakes, grab-and-go maneuver. Nearby, a long-haired observer could only stare blankly, completely baffled by the protagonist's sudden intensity. Emerging from the shadows, Grid soon found himself standing in the center of a stone plaza, surrounded by a group of seasoned adventurers. He tried to play it cool with an awkward, sweating smile and a friendly wave, but the tension remained thick. One of the female warriors turned on him with an intimidating glare, mockingly questioning if he intended to rely solely on his gear. Grid met her insults with a deadpan, unimpressed stare, refusing to let her shameless accusations rattle his composure. The confrontation was suddenly interrupted when a massive, muscular figure loomed over the group, drawing everyone's startled attention. This powerful warrior stepped forward with a confident smile, his sheer presence radiating an aura of overwhelming strength. The surrounding adventurers watched in shock as the legendary Regis arrived. The Titan greeted them with a gentle and surprisingly friendly smile. The female warrior couldn't help but scold him, telling him there ought to be a limit to his kindness. Relieved to have an ally, Grid gave an enthusiastic thumbs up, sharing a brief moment of mutual respect with the kind-hearted ranker. Sometime later, Grid allowed a mischievous grin to spread across his face as he plotted his next advantage in private. He eventually joined a small group where a confident man gestured forward, urging the others to simply accept the strict advice of a high-level ranker. While one companion looked on with skepticism, the orange-haired leader remained firm in his authoritative stance. Grid's confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by a wide-eyed, deadpan expression as the reality of his situation set in. He began sweating profusely in a state of total panic when his opponent took a cheerful combat-ready pose and asked if they should begin. Shin Youngwoo sprinted across the open fields, his face a mask of pure desperation as he fled from his latest setback. Behind him, a bewildered onlooker could only watch in silence, unable to comprehend the frantic pace of the retreating warrior. Every labored breath and bead of sweat told the story of a man pushed to his absolute limit by the harsh realities of his journey. A shimmering system interface materialized before him, prompting for the name of a newly designed blade that represented his first real step into legendary craftsmanship. The prompt flickered with potential, showcasing a weapon that could change his fortunes if only he could master the forge. However, the weight of his new class became clear as the system warned him of limited creation slots, forcing him to realize he could only use this power when it was absolutely necessary. Grid steeled his resolve, deciding that the only path forward was to earn enough gold to properly study the nuances of item creation. His initial attempts were met with the cold, harsh reality of a system failure notification, proving that even a legendary title didn't guarantee immediate success. Undeterred, he made his way to the local workshop known as Smith's Smithy, hoping to find the tools and guidance needed to turn his luck around. Upon entering the heat-soaked workshop, the protagonist found the local blacksmith deep in his craft, the rhythmic ring of hammer against anvil filling the air. The burly craftsman paused his work to inspect the blueprint Grid offered, his expression quickly souring into one of deep skepticism. Before the young man could explain himself, the blacksmith hoisted his massive hammer high, his intimidating presence forcing a surge of nervous sweat from the aspiring creator. Swallowing his pride, the young warrior gestured frantically as he tried to justify his presence and his unusual requests to the unimpressed master of the forge. The blacksmith remained unmoved, standing firmly by his hearth while watching the stuttering youth with a look of pure confusion. Finally, the craftsman turned with a stern, sweat-streaked face, making it clear that he had no patience for those who had never truly dedicated themselves to the art of the strike. Grid looked down in bitter frustration, the weight of his mounting debts and failed plans pressing heavily against his shoulders. He stood dejectedly outside the shop with his head bowed, lamenting that this workshop was his only hope for earning the travel money he so desperately needed. With nowhere else to turn, He leaned his head against the cold stone wall in utter despair, feeling the crushing reality of his situation sink in. Grid's despair was interrupted by the creak of a heavy door as the blacksmith stepped back out, catching the young man off guard. The burly craftsman didn't offer words of comfort, but instead thrust a thick wooden log toward him, signaling a chance to work. A digital chime echoed in the air as a quest notification materialized, offering a glimmer of hope in the form of a manual labor task. Accepting the task with a nervous smile, Grid stood within the heat of the forge, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handle of a worn axe. He positioned himself over the timber, focusing every ounce of his concentration on the simple act of woodcutting. Despite the mundane nature of the job, the sheer realism of the game's physics began to grate on him, forcing him to wipe sweat from his brow in mounting frustration. As he inspected the tool in his hands, a status window revealed the hidden potential of the old axe, momentarily stunning the debt-ridden player. His eyes widened when the system calculated a perfect success rate, projecting a faint, glowing guideline directly across the surface of the wood. With the path of the strike illuminated, he brought the blade down with newfound confidence, watching as the log split into two perfect halves with a satisfying crack. A manic laugh escaped Grid as he realized that mastering the understanding of legendary items could be his ticket to ultimate success. He shouted his ambitions toward the sky, envisioning a future where his craftsmanship would finally pull him out of poverty. However, the physical toll of the labor soon caught up to him, leaving him sprawled face down on the workshop floor, surrounded by the remnants of his hard work. Panting heavily with his face pressed against the dirt, the young man felt the crushing weight of his fatigue, his body screaming for him to stop. He forced himself to his feet by leaning heavily on the axe handle, his movements sluggish but driven by a desperate need to survive. Gritting his teeth through the exhaustion, he vowed not to procrastinate, knowing that every log split brought him one step closer to escaping this backwater town. Grid pushed his body to the absolute limit, his eyes burning with a fierce determination as he prepared for one final repetition. His focus was shattered when a brilliant blue status window suddenly flickered into existence, signaling an unexpected change in his attributes. Startled by the crackling energy that surged around him, he leaped back in shock, wondering what kind of notification could possibly trigger such a violent reaction from the system. A new notification flickered to life, revealing the persistence stat which granted him the ability to resist fatigue. As a warm green glow enveloped his hands, Grid felt his exhaustion vanish instantly, replaced by a surge of unnatural rejuvenation. Despite the relief, the sheer absurdity of the system's sudden intervention left him sweating and wide-eyed with shock. The local smithy was a modest building marked by a weathered sign where the ring of hammers usually filled the air. Outside, a massive mountain of freshly cut logs sat waiting to be processed, stacked high against the workshop wall. From every angle, the sheer volume of timber emphasized the backbreaking labor that lay ahead for anyone tasked with moving it. Grid is sent tumbling backward, his body slamming hard into a jagged pile of logs with a painful thud. He lies sprawled across the wood, offering a sheepish grin to the looming smith who watches him with a mixture of concern and skepticism. After wiping the sweat from his brow, Grid manages to find his voice and confidently declares that, despite his current pathetic state, he is a blacksmith by trade. The burly smith looms over him, thrusting a heavy black pickaxe toward Grid as if testing his resolve. A quest notification materializes in the air, tasking Grid with mining 80 iron ores to prove his worth to the workshop. Seeing the promise of experience points and increased affinity, Grid's frustration evaporates, replaced by a manic grin of renewed determination. Deep within the shadows of the mine, seasoned laborers swung their heavy tools with practiced precision, the rhythmic strike of metal against stone echoing through the tunnels. Grid, however, was already at his breaking point, hunched over his pickaxe and gasping for air as his stamina bottomed out. He clutched his neck in agony, his body trembling under the strain of a physical exertion that far exceeded his meager stats. The veteran miners paused their work to eye the newcomer with weary suspicion, unimpressed by his lack of endurance. They pointed and whispered among themselves, openly questioning why such a weakling had been sent to work alongside them in the pits. Grid could only look down in bitter frustration, the sting of their insults adding to the physical misery of his failed labor. One of the veteran laborers pointed a stern finger at the novice, barking orders and complaining about the burden of teaching such a weakling. Grid stood small against the rough cave wall, absorbing the insults until a sudden, thunderous crack echoed through the tunnel. The miners spun around in shock, their eyes wide as the sound of shattering stone drowned out their complaints. Amidst the dust and debris, a glowing purple crystal emerged from the rock, shimmering with an ethereal light that caught everyone off guard. Grid didn't hesitate, swinging his pickaxe with a level of focus that bordered on madness as he shattered the glowing blue veins. The surrounding workers could only stare in stunned silence as a literal mountain of iron ore began to pour out from the wall. As his muscles screamed in protest, a memory of a stern man's harsh dismissal flickered through Grid's mind, reminding him of those who told him to give up on his pointless persistence. He looked past the dark, cold peaks of his past failures and channeled that bitterness into a single, devastating strike. The impact of his pickaxe against the stone was no longer the sound of a weakling, but the roar of a man refusing to break. The veteran miners watched with growing amazement, their initial mockery replaced by wide-eyed grins as they witnessed the young man's inexplicable prowess. Even the foreman couldn't hide his surprise, noting that the novice possessed a raw talent that could make him a legendary miner if he stayed the course. Unfazed by the praise, Grid continued to hammer away at the massive rock wall, his movements becoming a rhythmic blur of pure effort. A blinding flash of white light erupted as the pickaxe finally struck the heart of the ore vein, signaling a massive discovery. Grid let out a guttural scream of pure exertion, pouring every ounce of his remaining strength into the final blow. Drenched in sweat and gasping for air, he wore a manic, determined grin that proved his persistence was anything but pointless.